this is our video on unemployment. And before we get into any specifics of the details about how we calculate unemployment or about how the types of unemployment affect the rates and all that good stuff, you have to understand something. There can never be 0% unemployment, okay? 0% unemployment is unrealistic. It's like, impossible. For one, for a variety of reasons. The first is you're here, the jobs are over there. You don't want to go there. So let's say you are qualified, you are looking for a job, so you're in the labor force, you're not currently employed, and there's a job that meets your skill set, but it's in Williston, North Dakota. And you grew up here in the New York metro area. You don't want to move to rural North Dakota. So you're still unemployed. Okay? So if the jobs are not where the people are who can work them, there's going to be people without jobs. Okay. Another thing too is the skill set differences. There are, and this was true even in my day when I was a fast food manager. There were many people who I was working with who were journalism majors, and there were business majors and English lit majors, and they're fast food managers. So there's always this kind of skill set disconnect where, your skill set doesn't match up with the available jobs. And you don't want to become a Starbucks barista in the meantime. So there's a lot of reasons why you'll never have 0% unemployment. And those are the two big ones: the geographic location of the jobs and the skill sets involved in the jobs, and you don't qualify for that. Okay, second misconception here that we have to clear up is that if you have a part-time job, a part-time legitimate job, above board, taking paycheck deductions out, all that kind of stuff, you are employed. You are considered employed. Even though you may be a master degreed scientist, PhD in science, and you're working as that Starbucks barista, the fact that you are working and you have a legitimate job means you're employed. Now, there is no statistic as to underemployed. That's where you get that person who is totally too qualified or misqualified for that job, and they're working it. So, if you're part-time employed, 1 job, 2 jobs, 3 jobs, whatever, as long as they're legit jobs, boom, you are employed. So that's the whole big craziness thing here. Now, those are the 2 biggest misconceptions people have about the unemployment rate. Now, there are different types of unemployment rate. There's U9, U6, U3. It's a thumbnail sketch. I mean, any of these big statistics like inflation or unemployment, there's always going to be exceptions to the rule. There's always going to be areas that are better than others. Like prior to the pandemic, unemployment in North Dakota was like 2.3%. It was ridiculous. Why? Because of the oil fields. A lot of people working in the oil fields and the support industries around Williston, North Dakota. And other states could be 11, 12%, depending on what the circumstances are. So it's a national average, but then you have to break it down to the state and locals side of things to really get the true picture of an area. So let's talk about how you would calculate an unemployment rate before we get into the specifics of it. So I'm going to share screen. Now, this is not on the PowerPoint anywhere, so I'm just going to share that. All right. The first thing here is that top construction here, is that you have the total number of unemployed. Now, how do we figure out the unemployed? We won't know that you are unemployed unless you're showing up at the unemployment office to put in a claim. So there are going to be some people who are going to slip through the cracks here, the people who are between jobs, who may spend a couple of weeks without a job, but then pick up another job. All right, but we're talking about these people who are chronic. These are people who are month after month after month after month might be unemployed because their factory got closed down or some other circumstance. So the total number of unemployed divided by the labor force. Now, the labor force, we're going to have some exclusions, and you're going to have to take some notes here because there are some exclusions to the labor force that you have to reckon with. Not every person is in the labor force. And, we do have to make certain assumptions that teenagers are going to be in school. So the first exception is children. We assume that children are not going to be in the labor force. Now, if you are a teenager who does have a part-time legitimate job, you have entered the labor force. So you did voluntarily cross that line that has protected you called childhood. You've got your working papers, and now you're into the workforce. And you now have a job. So you've crossed that barrier. But for the most part, children do not count here. People who have retired don't count. Now, again, if they retire but then come back because part-time, they need to work part-time or they want to work part-time. Like you have a lot of substitute teachers in our building who were retired teachers. Why? The pension's good, but maybe they just kind of bored and they just want to make some pin money, some extra money for their kids or grandkids or whatever. But again, they are voluntarily stepping from the retiree line into the labor force. When you retire, you take yourself out of the labor force. A stay-at-home mom or dad. This is a person who decides voluntarily to stay home and raise children. That person takes themselves out of the labor force, so they don't count. All right. Active military do not count. Okay. Actively deployed or military personnel do not count. People in prison do not count. And America has one of the largest percentages of any industrialized capitalist country when it comes to the number of people every night who are incarcerated. That's not one of the things we should be proud of. This isn't one of the statistics that makes America great again. This is one of the embarrassing statistics, but they don't count. And even if there are prison jobs where they make in the traditional kind of stereotypical behavior was prisoners making license plates. So the New Hampshire license plate, which says "Live Free or Die," is made by a prisoner, a state prison. No, they don't count. So you got a couple million people there every night that don't count. All right, so you just think about what we're doing now. We're excluding children. We're excluding stay-at-home parents. We're excluding retirees. We're excluding criminals. We're excluding, active military. So you realistically only have, in this country's case, maybe 150 to 160 million out of our 320 million. Now, there's another statistic that people like to throw around here called the labor force participation rate, meaning that of those people who are eligible to participate, who does step up here. And that number kind of fluctuates a lot, but we're going to focus on the unemployment rate here. So whatever the labor force is, that's the bottom number. Okay, that's all the people who are there. The potentials. Now, you graduate college, you are now in the labor force because there's an assumption, unless you're immediately going to graduate school, that you are going to be actively pursuing a job. So once you get that diploma in your hand, you're now a job seeker. And, technically you could start up the next Monday. You graduate on a Friday and Monday you start with a job. So you have a job there and that's what you've got. All right. So you have all the exclusions. Then you put together who can be in the labor force. And then you calculate how many people are unemployed. Now, an unemployed person is in the labor force. Okay. So, don't exclude them. I mean, they are in the labor force. It's just by circumstance or by design, they're not employed right now. So if you have a total labor force and you see the statistic at the bottom of 100 million and 6 million people are unemployed. Now, again, how do we calculate that? If you go to your state unemployment office and file a claim, then we can kind of get an idea of that. Now, again, we've got a lot of problems, a lot of issues with these bigger statistics. What happens to people who are working cash jobs? If you're a cash job person, whether it's shoveling sidewalks for your neighbors in the wintertime, cutting their grass in the summertime, if you're babysitting, or if you're just working for your uncle under the table, that doesn't count. You're not in the labor force. It's not a legitimate job. So, it doesn't count. So you got those people there. Now, there is one more category that we have to play with here that helps us determine that number. And it is a category called a discouraged worker. A discouraged worker is what the name sounds like. It's somebody who has beaten their head up, walked up, taken many interviews or have gotten no interviews, a person who has probably exhausted their unemployment compensation from the state and now has to, kind of face reality here. And that person could become discouraged and get into like a cash job, potentially illegal activities. But that person walks away for right now. So if a worker becomes discouraged and walks away from the labor force, we have to subtract them from the labor force number. So you get that the kind of bit mad rush every time you run into an economic recession or depression, where you have to kind of cut the budgets and you cut the the spending on unemployment compensation, and where it runs out at 26 weeks or 13 weeks, 39 weeks, whatever, those people kind of disappear for a while. So again, the discouraged worker, you have to take that number. You take them out of the unemployed because they're no longer seeking employment, and you take them out of the labor force. So let's play around. And this is how you can manipulate these statistics. So let me bring up a calculator here. Okay, put that over there. Let's assume that we go from 6 million to 5 million. Let's assume that 1 million workers become discouraged and walk away. All right. They're not going into the job market. They're not actively seeking a job. They're not claiming any kind of compensation insurance, nothing. All right. So in 1 million. So 5 million now, top number, 99 million at the bottom. So 5 divided by 99 equals, and then we multiply that by 100. So our unemployment rate would drop to 5.05% if we had 1 million discouraged workers walk away. Now, that's why this statistic isn't as necessarily great as it could be because of that. And the part-time worker argument is also a problem here with that. So if you play around with the numbers, you can make this go crazy. What happens if that 1 million comes back into the workforce? They start getting job interviews or start at least the process of it. Then you have to add them to the labor force, and you have to add them to the unemployed, and we're back up at 6%. So you have to be careful with statistics. Mark Twain had a very smart comment here. There are 3 types of lies, 2 types of lies in the world. 3 types of lies. There's lies, damn lies, and statistics. Okay, and we can bend statistics to do anything we want. So you have to be careful with that. All right, so that's how you calculate the unemployment rate. That's what you have to worry about in terms of the exclusions of who's in the labor force and what's considered unemployed. Okay, remember the part-time argument also. If you're a part-time legitimate job, you are employed. All right, so we'll stop that share right there, and we'll get to the PowerPoint now. And we'll talk about the types of unemployment that happen, okay? And again, the types of unemployment might be new to you. The terminology might be new to you. So, and at any point, you should have been doing this all along. Here we are in chapter 7 and chapter 6, and we've gone these videos, and anytime you've come across a video that you need to stop and pause it, you pause it and go back and watch it again. So I'm doing these videos. Okay, so let's talk about the types of causes of unemployment. And the major cause of unemployment is a structural problem. These are dinosaurs. And as I had mentioned previously in other videos, dinosaurs must die in the sense that they don't belong, okay? Dinosaurs need to disappear. You know where Sam's Club is? Up on Route 1 in Edison? Okay, on that grounds, that whole big grounds there, was at one time a Ford auto assembly plant. They made the F-150 pickup trucks there until 2004. What do you do if you're an auto worker and you've been working 25 years in an automobile factory? You're in your early 50s or late 40s, early 50s. You're not ready for retirement yet, and that factory closed down. Your skill set is for automotive manufacturing, and you're not going to move down south where they're going to pay you half as much, and you got to live in, remote Alabama or northwestern Georgia to work at a non-union auto shop down there. Your skill set don't match. You're a dinosaur. You are structurally unemployed. These are the most difficult people to get jobs because they really seriously have to do retraining, and they have to learn some skills that are applicable in the modern day. Now, I mentioned the stay-at-home parent routine there, and I got the second picture here. Sorry, stereotypically, the stay-at-home people tend to be females. If you took off 10, 15 years to raise kids, now your skill set, those whatever skills you had and whatever field you had back 15 years ago may not be applicable, may not be usable, may not be workable today. So, and if you didn't do anything in that 15 years to kind of brush up on whatever your particular job skills were, you might be structurally unemployed until you learn the new skills. All right. And this is another reason why there will always be unemployment. There will always be people who just don't fit in. And this is the dinosaurs. These dinosaurs are just, they can't be retrained. You could do all you want. I mean, the C24 room where the business computer rooms are there, That room, when I first started here in 1994, that room had really old, computers. Have you ever seen a bootable 5.25 floppy disk that was literally floppy? The Tandy TS-1000s and TS-3000s were there. Well, the school district got a grant from Middlesex County to try to retrain workers who have these structural job deficiencies and give them some computer skills. So they upgraded the lab at the time, putting in gateway computers. And the thing is, they had to run night school classes there to have them to retrain these workers, who would pass through these job training skill programs. You got to do it. You got to do it. You got to become useful. Now, my dad, who worked as a chemical factory worker at Roman Haas, they made plexiglass. That was their big product. So they made paint thinners and paint chemicals and pesticides and all that kind of stuff too. But for the first 30 years of his work life, he was in the production line. Then he transferred over to shipping. So, he's basically loading trucks and with a forklift, loading the, stuff that's going out and bringing in raw materials at times on the trucks. And he retired in 1994, right at his 65th birthday, so he could collect Social Security. So literally, his birthday month was January. He retired at the end of January. He starts collecting Social Security and his pension in February. And he said that, he probably could have hung on a few more years because the shipping job was certainly not as stressful, not as demanding physically on him as it would be if it was in production. My mom had just passed away. She was on kidney dialysis for 3 years. So it was a real kind of emotionally draining time for my family at that time because my dad had to run her back and forth to dialysis, or I did, I was living at home. And, but she had passed away in October the previous year. So he could have worked, but he's like, they're computerizing everything. And I don't want to learn a computer. And, up to the day he died, which was in February of 2017, my father never had a cell phone. I mean, no smartphones, no cell phones, period. He never had a personal computer, never had an email address. He had a calculator. I mean, and a TV remote. I mean, that was about it. So he understood that it was time for him to leave. And he didn't want to become one of these dinosaurs trying to be retrained. Now, he was fortunate to work in a place for 40 years. That is another thing you should kind of put in the back of your head here, is that the jobs that you and I, the jobs that you will take. I mean, I'm a teacher, but I was a fast food manager. I worked for 3 different fast food operations. I worked for Taco Bell corporate. I worked for Burger King franchisee. And I worked for Little Caesars Pizza, a franchisee. And then I worked in a retail manager setting for 4.5, 5 years, almost 5 years. And, there's jobs and you're going to have lots of jobs. You're not going to stay in one. You're not going to get out of college and have a job and stay there for 40 years, probably because you don't want to stay there and because of your own personal ambitions and because the job's not going to be there unless you become a teacher. And, you start off when you're age 22 coming out of college, and you can teach until you have to teach until you're 67 to get a pension. So there, 45 years, if you want to do that. But to have a job that you can actually get a pension, to have steady employment. Wow. But again, the understanding is that even if you're in that job, you're going to have to keep being retrained. I mean, teachers have to go through, and we do professional development all the time. A lot of it's content driven. Some of it is pedagogical, which means it's how we teach, the process of teaching. But you have you have to stay current, or you become a fossil. You become the dinosaur. So structural unemployment is the hardest nut to crack here because, again, those people that just their skill sets don't match up. And what are we going to do about that? All right, frictional. Frictional unemployment is a hard one to measure because it's people who are between jobs. Now, technically, you graduate college, you are now frictionally unemployed because you're between jobs. You're between that status of the protected bubble of college. Now you're out in the workforce, and boom, you need to get a job. And most people who quit jobs, they either quit jobs because they have another one lined up and maybe it starts in 6 weeks, or they're quitting a job and they're going to go through the process again. They're not going to be, if you quit a job, you don't necessarily get unemployment compensation. So if you quit a job, you've probably on your mind already thought about this, that you're going to be out there the next week looking for jobs. You already stuck your resumes. While you were still working, you were already sending your resumes out and booking interviews. So frictional unemployed. are those people, and it's hard to figure, but it's a small, if structural unemployment makes up the bulk of our unemployment rate, the frictional unemployment is going to be the kind of icing on top. Now, those two categories together combined are what is called the natural rate of unemployment, or NRU. The natural rate of unemployment would be the lowest theoretical unemployment rate we could get if everything worked right. Okay, the dinosaurs are still there. You can't turn them with some kind of magic wand. Poof! Now you're a computer office worker after working 25 years at Ford. No, those people and the frictionals are going to be there. So our job is to eliminate anything else when it comes to unemployment. Again, you can work slow process of training the dinosaurs, and the frictional will take care of themselves. But you know that those two, and again, NRU is like the lowest theoretical possible rate. Now, when I was going to college, my first college, I was at Northwestern for a year, and one of the economists, I took an economics class, and one of the economists who was teaching there was very big in this theory development of the natural rate of unemployment. He thought at that time that if everything worked well in 1979, 80 time period, that we maybe could get the unemployment rate down to 5.5. Now, it wasn't 5.5 at the time, but he suggested that it was somewhere 5.5. Now, as we got through the 90s and into the 2000s, that number theoretically is somewhere between 3.5% and 4%. In a place like South Korea, the natural rate of unemployment is 2.5%. So it depends on the circumstances of the country. It's not one set principles. But the natural rate of unemployment, NRU, remember at the beginning of the year I asked you to create a abbreviations list. Well, here we go again. The NRU is this combined structural and frictional rates. Okay, structural and frictional rates of unemployment. That's as low as we can go without some kind of serious sea change in our economy where we go back to manufacturing, for example. Well, that takes time to build a factory. All right, so now cyclical unemployment is the variable here. Okay, if we assume that the structural rate of unemployment stays relatively the same unless there is some massive change in the economy, we go from agriculture to industry, industry to tech, then the cyclical is everything that's built up on top of it. Now, here you have on this graph, you have the unemployment rates, or the GDP, I should say, GDP, and the recessions. Okay, in recessions, you're going to have cyclical unemployment. When we are, obviously, the COVID recession hit so fast, unemployment went up to 15%, came back down to 11 as some of the states started reopening. But is it going to go back down? We're still stuck in a bad cycle, so it's not going to come back down to where it was at 3.6 or 3.7%, where it was prior to March of 2020. But in every case where you see a recession, you can assume that jobs are being lost. The economy takes a pause, takes a, sometimes it's got to go to the bathroom, kneel down before the toilet and throw up, get rid of whatever ailing it right now. But cyclical unemployment is what drags us down. Okay, so you have the NRU components, which are structural and frictional, and then anything cyclical is on top of it. And that is the majority of this rate. Now, cyclical refers to cycles. In a bad business cycle, when we are down with the trough at the bottom, we're going to have higher rates of unemployment. And when we're peaking through an economic expansion, we're going to get rid of all the cyclical unemployment, and we're going to possibly kind of nibble a little bit at that structural frictional block. And like I said, we went from 5.5 to 4 to 3.5-ish over the 40 years since 1979 when I learned about this. But that means that there's very few people who are looking for a job who are active, who are not finding a job. If you're in a perfect good expansion, which is the white areas on this chart, the jobs are out there. You find them, and if you quit, you could probably find a job next week in the same field, maybe making more money. So everything works. But in a down cycle, this is where all the bad stuff just kind of falls, and we're try not to step over all the garbage that's there, but we sometimes can't get out of our way. All right. because, during a down cycle, you got to cut back. You got to cut staff. Think about all the people who are unemployed at Disneyland. Disney California not open yet. Disneyland in Florida, Disney World in Florida, partially open. It's better than nothing, but it's not back to normal cycles. Sine wave. Think about sine wave. Here's the line, here's the sine wave. That's what it is. Cyclical unemployment. This is the result of the business cycle. This is the result of just stuff happening. Some of it's predictable, some of it is intentional, some of it is just circumstance. And then we have seasonal unemployment or seasonal employment, depending on how you look at it. And you've got lucky Leos here in Seaside. You work the stands outside, you work the games outside. They hire a lot of people. Now, surprisingly enough, not a lot of people want to work at the Jersey Shore, because my wife and I found out many times when we were down there that a lot of these places hire people on special work programs. A lot of Russians and people from Eastern Europe coming by, and all these seashore resorts. They work 40, 50 hours a week. They get paid minimum wage. They enjoy it because obviously minimum wage is in America, and the money they can spend it here or they send it home. But that's when you're going to have some ups and downs because of seasonal employment. Obviously, during the retail Christmas holidays, you might hire some extra staff, but then cut them in January. If you're a ski resort, you're going to have a big hiring binge in October, November. You're going to lay them off in March. So seasonal is those jobs that are expected to be only operating during a particular season. But that number shifts. As one fades, another one comes to bloom. So that is there. But I think we also understand that people who have those seasonal jobs understand the very nature of what they're doing. They may be retired and then enter the seasonal marketplace because they like going to baseball games. So they work as an usher or a ticket taker at Somerset Patriots Ballpark in Bridgewater. That's what you do. Okay, so we have that. Now, if you look about kind of comparing the rates here between various groups, there are some rather kind of easily understood examples. And then there's some that are kind of like, what? Here you look at the unemployment rates between men and women. And if you notice, the unemployment rate for women traditionally was in the 70s into the early 80s was higher than for men. Again, factory worker type jobs tend to be dominated by men. Well, by 1980, we're starting to jettison some of those factory jobs to the third world. Cars are being made in Japan, Korea. We have T-shirts made in Bangladesh, Myanmar, Burma, Costa Rica, Honduras. So, and then China. So you can see that by the 1980s, the mid-80s, the unemployment rate for men and women tends to be a statistical wash, meaning that it's within the statistical error. So if you just say, out of the women who are in the workforce or who are in the labor force, they have the same unemployment rate overall as men who are in the labor force. Okay, so statistically, it's a wash. All right, and even though our textbook is 15 years old, it still holds true today. Okay, you notice the unemployment rate. You could kind of not, you don't have to see the gray bars here to understand that you had a recession in 1991 into 92. You have a recession here in 2000. 2001 time period, 2001 with 9/11, adding a couple months to it. And then obviously the unemployment rate here, you can tell you're in a recession. All right, so unemployment rate going up does signify that, up in a big way, it signifies you're in a recession. Okay, so you can look at these charts and you can tell where the recessions are. And this one ended in 2000, this chart ended in 2009. Okay, again, we are comparing groups here. High school diploma, no high school diploma. Guess who is going to be unemployed more? That's a no-brainer. If you want to talk about it, a high school diploma trumps and I'm using that small t, trumps a dropout, high school dropout. A college degree should have a lower unemployment rate than a high school degree, high school diploma. Certainly more than a high school dropout. So those are the kind of education and young people issues you should understand. Now, young people are going to have a problem going forward if I can't retire. My circumstance is a little different. In my head, I know when I'm planning to retire, but if you have somebody who's been working as a teacher for 40 years, age 60, they want to retire, but if they can't retire because the pensions have not been taken care of by the state, or they didn't plan well on their own, or there's some kind of extraneous circumstance, they're going to stick around longer. They're not going to retire early. And this idea of early retirement, yeah, you know, if you're Jeff Bezos, you made $13 billion in one day when your stock went up. You know, this is on July 20th. I'm recording this July 21st. And, you know, so he can retire. But if the older people don't get out of the way, if they can't get out of the way and retire, that's going to back everybody up. The younger people, the 20-somethings who have their college degrees, are not going to see those openings. They're going to be the ones working as baristas at Starbucks. So younger people tend to be more unemployed than older people. Obviously, the businesses recognize experience. They recognize that they don't have to keep retraining people. If you have somebody with 20 years experience versus firing them and hiring a young person at half the salary. Yeah, but if you got to watch that person, if you got to monitor that person, not really worth it. White versus black, you know, yeah, okay. It's, you know, it is statistically there. The unemployment rate for African Americans is statistically higher than whites. It's, you know, when it comes to Latinos, also tends to be higher than whites, the unemployment rate. There's one group that doesn't kind of fit that, and that's Asians. Asians tend to have at least equal to whites or slightly less unemployment rate than whites. So again, young versus old, educated versus not educated, black, Latino versus white. You know where that's going to fall, who's going to be more inclined to have a higher unemployment rate. But men, women, no, not. It's a statistical wash. All right, so now we're going to talk about Okun's Law. And Okun's Law ties into one of those graphs that we talked about earlier. Let me pop that up. Let me just pause my recording here for a second. Let me just pause for a second. Okay, I did find what I needed. Sorry for the delay there, a little skitterish. Let me talk a little bit about Okun's Law. And, you know, Okun's Law is based on an idea that there is potential GDP and there is the actual GDP. And when you have cyclical unemployment, and I'll get back to the Okun slide in a minute. I just wanted to show you, this is a chart that's in chapter 7. So anytime you're in a recession, when you have cyclical unemployment, it's dragging the economy down. It's dragging you're jettisoning jobs. You're good people working. These aren't dinosaurs that you're firing in a cyclical unemployment cycle, in a bad recession downturn. You're not jettisoning dinosaurs. You're jettisoning good people because you can't afford to keep them on. So what you're doing is you're losing the potential of their work. So if you look at this kind of bubble below here in the middle of the graph, and that's 91, 92, 93 time period. And this is a loss, okay? The economy is not as efficient as it could be. If it's operating on the red line, it would be a perfect kind of efficiency. And what Okun suggested was, and the reason why they called it a law is because it was mathematically kind of verified, that if for every 1% of cyclical unemployment, which is layered on top of the structural frictional NRU block, you're losing 2% of your potential GDP. So as a mathematical ratio, for every 1% of cyclical unemployment, you're going to have 2% GDP loss. Now, there are questions that, and I'll throw a couple examples, but not right here, right now. I'm going to put it on a separate little assignment and ask you to try to calculate that out. But you're losing. Okay, so if you look at what happened in this chart, obviously doesn't take into account what happened in 2007 and 9, but we had 10.6% unemployment. So let's assume that the natural rate of unemployment is in 2007, let's assume it's 4%. If we have 10.6% unemployment, That means we have 6.6% of cyclical unemployment because of the cutbacks, because of the bad mortgages and everything else that went on. That means we potentially lost 13% of our GDP. So if we assume that our GDP was around $20 trillion at that time, we lost 13%. We lost $2.6 trillion worth of activity because it's not being produced. People are unemployed. They can't produce goods and services. So Okun theorized this, and again, because it's considered Okun's law, it's considered to be valid in that mathematical construct. 1% cyclical unemployment equals 2% loss of potential GDP. So again, the question could be worded that this is the how much would you lose if we had a 5% cyclical unemployment on top of the NRU components of structural frictional. Now, what interesting came about is that he only focused really on the negative consequences of a recession and the loss. But in the late 90s, we actually were operating above the curve. So that purple area here is what's called a positive GDP gap. We were temporarily operating at about 100 and, or so, 101, 102%. Now, if the NRU is 4.5, let's assume 4.5 maybe. Does it work on the flip side? Does it work when we actually are below that? So the unemployment rate in the last part of the 1990s did get below 4%, or got below 4.5. I think it got to like 3.7, 3.8 maybe. And I think at the time they were trying to think that maybe the NRU was at 4.5, and because not everybody could work tech at that time. But if we're at 3.5, that means we're at a positive 1%. Does that mean we are operating at 102% of potential GDP? And the answer is yes. Now, it's a rare circumstance where we're actually operating above, but it's only short term. You can't stay there forever without the LRAS curve shifting rightward or blowing the economy up. But Okun's law does work in that case of a positive GDP gap. So you could actually be above your potential for a short period of time. It's like that athlete who can, for a brief moment, overperform for what their norms were, even at the best of circumstances. So, Okun's law is there. Now, let me pause again, and I'll bring back that Okun slide. Okay, so we're back. And again, the relationship between the natural rate of unemployment and the loss during cyclical unemployment of potential GDP is something to consider here. And again, the damage is, it's significant because, again, you're not jettisoning dinosaurs here. You're jettisoning good workers who could be potentially producing, but because there's no demand for it, you have to let them go. All right, so I guess, so I guess that is the last slide. Yeah, that is the last slide. All right, so, with Okun's law and with unemployment and with, all the things that go on here, it's not a perfect statistic, but it does give us an idea of what's going on. Again, you're taking a sampling of data and you're trying to extrapolate it out. And those of you who've had AP Stat or who are taking AP Stat are going to know the limitations of any kind of statistical manipulation, but it should be okay for us to use unemployment as one of the kind of measurements of economic health and stability. Okay, we'll do that. All right, so any questions about unemployment? FAQ page for that, please, and look for the assignment. Like I said, I might do some calculation or something, the assignment that's underneath the unemployment on the Canvas page.